What does conservatism actually conserve? This is a question that is asked almost every single time a dispute comes up on the political right in America, more broadly in the West. And oftentimes the answers offered by various different types of conservatives are lacking and they ring hollow in the ears of those who are thirsting for a true understanding and a substantive account of what's actually going on in their civilization. And I think one of the reasons many of these answers ring hollow is because they are not rooted in any semblance of philosophy. They are instead rooted in posturing, they are instead rooted in talking points, and they are instead rooted in the sentiments of the ages rather than being rooted in the stuff of the eternal. So in this video, my friends, I'm going to actually lay out what it means to be a conservative in the American sense. I'm going to articulate my philosophy of civic conservatism, which I have been talking about a lot on this channel for those of you who are regular viewers, and I'm going to explain exactly what that looks like and how it manifests in terms of the posture and in terms of the mentality the conservative has towards his society, his civilization, and human nature. But before we get into this, my friends, hope all of you are doing well. I am Christian Watson. Thank you so much for being here. If you enjoy political and social commentary with a philosophical bent, then I must implore you, please like, share, comment, subscribe, do whatever you can to ensure our operation here is successful. My friends, this is a civic conservative project. If you believe the fundamental philosophical character of the American experiment is worth preserving and pushing forth into the modern discourse, which oftentimes rings hollow with a lack of depth and oftentimes rings hollow with vain statements, this is the channel for you. If you believe that America deserves a better class of defenders, ones who are sustained off of moral clarity and sustained off of philosophical rigor, this is the channel for you. Thank you guys so much for being here. Like, share, comment, subscribe, and please enjoy the video. So, one of the biggest errors, before we get into this sort of exploration of what it means to be a conservative in America, one of the biggest errors I see people make is when they conflate conservatism with having a particular position on a particular issue. In other words, when they conflate their conservatism with the positions they hold. In all truth, my friends, positions do not reflect a worldview. Ethos reflects a worldview. Ethos is the heart and core of your worldview, the exact foundations of it, and actually what brings forth the reason those positions exist in the first place. So in order to have an ethos, you must have foundations. So in a sense, foundations are actually more important to what it means to be a conservative or what it means to hold any kind of worldview than your positions are. Because people from a variety of different worldviews can actually hold similar positions. For example, a progressive and a conservative may very well care about the notion of community and having strong communities in society. But the reason they care about communities, their conception of community, and the end to which they believe communities serve are all so vastly distinct and alien from each other, even though in the interim it seems like they have a same affection for community. The progressive, for example, may believe that community ought to be the catalyst of political change and that political order ought to conform to what is seen to be the idea of the common good. Whereas the conservative might believe, and we're going to get into these more defined differences in a second because there are some variations, but the conservative might believe that community is simply the vehicle of civil society, but that it is not sustained by government. It is, nor does it sustain government. It is instead sustained by a strong culture of virtue. Again, the worldviews are so different, but the positions look similar. So instead of staking your worldview on positions like I'm against legal immigration or I'm for legal immigration or whatever, stake them instead on foundations. So, to know what it is to be a conservative, we have to consider foundations. But we also have to consider what positions, a appraisal of positions and positions alone takes us away from. Because to be a conservative is not simply to have a position. It's not about positions. It's about principles. But it's also not about principles. It's about values. But it's also not just about values. It's about both civic and moral posture. But it's also just not about civic and moral posture. It's about foundations. But it's also just not about foundations. It's about the nature of foundations and what sustains the foundations in the first place. Think of society as being the results, the effects of a well-cultivated soil. And think of the conservative as being concerned with cultivating that soil, understanding the nature of that soil. A farmer cannot plant crops. He cannot create anything. His effects and actions are impotent in the real world unless the soil is well tilled and cultivated. So if we think of moral foundations as the soil upon which conservatism grows, we'll have a much more grounded idea. And the difference between a conservative that considers foundations first and considers positions first is the difference between somebody who is suspended in mid-air, who can be pushed to whatever direction the wind blows them, and someone whose feet is firmly burrowed and planted into the ground and fabric of their civilization, who can sustain and resist whatever temporary moment arises that might seek to push them some way, because they have the substance of moral conviction rooted in their behavior, rooted in their conscience, rooted in their posture. If your posture is not correct, that can mess you up physically. If someone has a bad sitting posture, that can then lead to a deterioration of their body. If you have a bad moral posture, that can lead to a deterioration of your conscience. The conscience is the seat of our moral thinking. And if our conscience is messed up, our reason does not have the substance by which to interpret and understand what is right and what is wrong. And therefore, we become subject to the whims of society rather than not being rooted in the proper objective moral order that the conservative upholds. The conservative, given their focus on foundations, is rooted, my friends, in the eternal, not the local. Conservatism is not a philosophy of moments. It is not a reactionary philosophy. It is not a philosophy that changes when the moods of society change. It's oftentimes said that conservatism is standing athwart history and yelling stop, but I think this is actually a little bit too of a weak posture. Because if you're simply standing athwart history and yelling stop, you're not understanding or appreciating the movement of history, and then also understanding how to contextualize and use your moral conviction to impose upon the movement of history so that it goes in the right way rather than simply going in the wrong way. Again, but if the conservative is simply a product of history, if he's simply a product of the historical moment, he can do nothing but be taken along with the move of history. But if he's a product of something bigger, something eternal, outside of that, outside of a sort of general moral order, then he is actually the one who can affect the course of history. He's actually the one who can affect the implications and the effects of progress in the society. In other words, when the conservative has the right moral and civic posture, it is not he who conforms to circumstances and situations. It is circumstances and situations that conform to him. Because think about this, because our moral conviction, when it reflects upon our actions, generates moral gravity, and moral gravity imposes upon the environment the conservative or anyone else as a strong sense of moral conviction finds himself in, so much so that it impresses upon that environment a tension. And the difference between that environment conforming to that move of gravity and that environment resisting it is how strong and convicted that person is, which is why you oftentimes see one thinker, one man in the course of history, or one group of men in the course of history can actually go in and they can shift circumstances and they can accord them to the right standard. They can go in and they can implant virtue in a particular circumstance, and virtue like a tree grows. Think of the founders. The founders were existing in a world, the old world, that was subsisted off of settled principles. The divine right of kings, God blessed power, but people could only get his blessings through power. Royal absolutism. Power was absolute. If you questioned it, your life was forfeit, meaning power claims dominion over your life and status. It is not through consent. It is not through merit that legitimacy arises. It is through the position somebody holds. The founders came in, and with moral gravity, with a strong, firm, planting moral conviction, they said, this does not conform to a sound observation of the world. This does not conform to the principles of human nature. This does not conform to what it actually means to have sound and right moral conduct. And they shifted with the moral gravity of their action, the circumstances and the situations of their day, and through it, they birthed one of the greatest odes to the truths of human nature that ever existed, which is America. So the conservative, the American conservative, is not worried about moments or the local. He's worried about what is true and then conforming society around him to the dictates of what is true. And so I mentioned this objective moral order. So since the conservative is concerned about foundations, he's concerned about what is true and what is demonstrable. And he begins here with man's nature. He begins here with human nature. And he understands that this objective moral order goes beyond a particular moment, goes beyond a particular geography, and it instead applies to all humans. All humans are under the same moral rules because our nature is all fundamentally the same. For the deviants that are not similar to us in human nature, the ones who, whether they be sociopaths or others, they're a separate category, but generally everyone's nature is perfectly the same. But this universal kind of nature cannot be acted upon a universal level. And this is why globalism and internationalism are both terrible doctrines, because they assume that we're going to be able to act on a level that can equally and perpetually consider everyone, when in our reality, the only way to manifest moral conduct is within a context of limitations, because man is a limited being by virtue of his nature. And so the nation state is actually a representative, it's actually a manifestation of limitations that actually guide man to act in sound and reasonable and rightly ordered ways. So the existence of the nation is a prerequisite for man to act morally and responsibly. But it's not just the nation, it's a specific kind of society that this kind of rightly ordered behavior can be sustained by. This rightly ordered and just society is going to be one where moral duty is emphasized over anything else. And then the moral duty of the people, that's going to particularly be our tendency towards justice, our tendency towards fidelity, which is the loyalty that society needs to be sustained, our tendency towards veracity, which is the pursuit of truth. Without truth, how can our social relationships even be trusted or have any credibility? Our tendency towards charitability, giving our opponent his due, our tendency towards benevolence, towards all these different things. These sustain society. Then the civic arises from this. And the institutions of our society, the norms and customs, they come out of this sort of operation. And then the political exists. The political is derived. The conservative understands that the political is derived from rightly ordered conduct and a formation of the civic based on that rightly ordered conduct. It is not derived, the people are not derived from it. So in other words, political order to be legitimate must be based on that sort of rightly ordered society. It cannot try to make society rightly ordered itself. So the political becomes the guardian of society. This is the anatomy of how you go from the foundations of conservatism to a nation to a civilization. So what does conservatism conserve? Conservatism does not simply conserve a certain way of life, although it can certainly do that. It does not simply conserve a certain custom or a certain norm. It does not simply conserve, as Edmund Burke would like to say, the traditions of a society just for the fact that those traditions existed. Conservatism conserves the moral order upon which all human conduct rests upon, without which society and human moral conduct is impossible. And then it conserves any institution, any norm, any habit, any custom that arises from that fresh and well-toiled objective moral terrain, and then it then conserves anything else that is a downstream effect of that. So the conservative, in order to know what he's conserving, must have a posture where he's not looking at moments, he's looking at foundations. And when he's analyzing foundations, he's asking the question, he's excavating in the civic and asking the question, do these foundations hold up to what my conscience and the principles implanted upon my heart say are true? And if they do, how can I best in my own society defend them in a way that keeps sociability alive? I almost forgot. Sociability. Man's social instinct, which drives him into mutual cooperation and social intercourse with other people, which is the lifeblood of civilization. The conservative is uniquely concerned with this because it is from the soil of our sociability that our moral duties arise. I cannot be just or unjust to a ghost or to an abstraction. I can only be just or unjust to a person, but not just any person, but the people who I am connected with on a certain level. But not just them, but those, of course, who I understand are also familiar to me in terms of being my fellow countrymen. In other words, my duties are not universal in terms of my ability to perform them. They are universal in scope, but they are specific in application. The conservative understands that, and because of that, society becomes the apple of his eye, the jewel of his eye. But he does not sacrifice himself to society. Society is what sustains his ability to act in a rightful way that sustains his conduct. And then after that, it also sustains his ability to pursue his own authenticity. Because a society of sociability, where we interact in terms of inauthentic behavior, is a society where deceit not veracity, is the standard, and that is a society where, unfortunately, it will not last for long. So for the conservative, history is not merely a justification for our existence. History is instead a means of assessing both the wisdom and failures of past ages and discerning the general patterns that might lead us to universal truth. But it is never in itself a sole standard of judgment, for the fact that some people acted a certain way a long time ago does not tell us that those actions were correct or beneficial, as many people are now realizing in the modern day debates on the political right. And most importantly, the conservative. The conservative is not simply a moral agent, he's also a citizen. And the citizen and the moral agent, they have a role together. To be a moral agent is to perform your moral duties and obligations, but to be a citizen is to have fidelity to a particular kind of society and then to reflect your moral duties and obligations within the context of that society so that they are not abstract and detached, but they are rooted and applicable to the circumstances around you. But, my friends, there are three levels of citizenship. There's the moral, again, those duties and obligations we have. There's the civic, the particular coloring and the particular infrastructure upon which our duties exist. And there's the political, how we use a rightly ordered mentality, how we use a fulfillment of our duty as a citizen to put pressure and then also put a skeptical emphasis on how political power should be ordered. So from the relationship between the moral agent, the citizen, and the government is one of not just self-correction and contextualization, but it's also one of a well-ordering of political authority. That means the moment the civic becomes untenable is the moment one of the most important levels of correcting potential tyrannical impulse and power, and also one of the most important levels for ensuring that our moral conduct is not impotent, it goes away, and then that leads to a collapse in structure. So the civic conservative, my friends, is someone who understands that conservatism it means to be a moral agent, to have duties and obligations to others in society, but also to be pro-social. That means to want to maintain and to sustain the institutions, the norms, habits, and customs of your society that reflect those universal moral principles and maintain them against those within the civic, within society that would seek to tear them apart, and those within the halls of power. That's why I say I'm a civic conservative, not because I simply like tradition for the sake of tradition, but because as an American, I carry upon my back the accumulated wisdom of the ages. I carry upon my back the accumulated progress and actions of my founders who bequeathed this nation to me and to all of you who are Americans who are watching this, to posterity, because they understood this was a continuous project, not a static imposition upon a king somewhere else, but a continuous project that must grow from the fertile soil of our moral foundations, which emerged from a strong-hearted man, a well-ordered man. And so to be a civic conservative is not simply to be someone who likes your institutions or likes your society. To be a civic conservative is to be someone who understands that without the civic, the civilization cannot persist. Without the society, the civilization cannot persist. And without the relationship between the moral and the civic, there can be no rightly ordered person in society, and there can be no rightly ordered political order in society. There can only be a tyranny. That's why I say I'm a civic conservative, because I recognize how these things play off each other in these necessary relationships. So conservatism only gets to positions later on, but it is fundamentally about conserving a posture that makes us fit for society, conserving a posture that allows us to fulfill our moral duties, conserving a posture that can help us have a healthy conscience, which will then contextualize our moral actions, and then, of course, conserving a posture that will allow all those things to work in the direction of keeping political order as a guardian of society, rather than simply as a maker of society. That's what conservatism, in my opinion, is trying to conserve. And any policy disputes that arise from that soil, they obviously have answers. Obviously, you can't have mass immigration and try to conserve a civic society. You can't, because the civic is not simply the civic is maintained on the basis of fidelity, and fidelity requires connection. And the more people you have coming into your country, the less you weaken connection, you weaken cohesion, and therefore the civic is undermined. So obviously, you would oppose mass immigration. But here's what I'm trying to impart upon all of you. You shouldn't try to assess someone's conservative bona fides on the basis of principal differentiations. You must assess them on the basis of their understanding of foundations and their posture. and their appreciation for human nature. If you can do those things, my friends, there can be room for a broad, big tent where there are some disagreements on positions, but there are no disagreements on foundations. The moment we compromise foundations to get somewhere in the political world is the moment we compromise the civic, and we undermine the very agent that keeps the political world honest in a free society. My friends, like, share, comment, subscribe, do whatever you can. My friends, study history, study philosophy. If these words empowered you or touched you, be sure to go ahead and join the Pensive cohort. It's my collection of young thinkers who are going to go into the discourse. And then we're going to go ahead and proselytize the philosophical ideas of Americanism and some of the thinkers who helped build the ethos of our country up. We're gonna go ahead and push them into the modern age. So be sure to go join our Discord if you want to join the Pensive cohort. My friends, study history, study philosophy, remain more convicted, and please stay pensive. Bye, guys.